Welcome to Andy Auto Vault. Today I have with me here this new flagship IEM from Hidizs, which is Hidizs MS5 Mermaid series number 5. It is also called as Dark Angel. So let's just proceed and have a look at the content of this box itself. As you can see here, it is a flagship IEM from Hidizs, and the box itself reflects the nature of it. Very premium looking with gold accent here and there. And inside the box, of course, you'll find the IEM itself, as you can see here, with the cable already attached, right? And we also have here a set of accessories. These are in fact included with 3 different type of ear tips, namely balance ear tip, vocal ear tip, bass ear tip, and most interestingly here, detachable user configurable nozzles. As we can see here, this is definitely very premium looking. In fact, constructed of aluminum at the back here, with front faceplate seemingly with open cavities, allowing for air to go in and out. So it is in fact some sort of a open back IEM. The build itself is very solid. What I find very interesting is that despite the heft and the weight of it, it is in fact very comfortable. I was able to wear this continuously from anywhere from 4 hours to 6 hours without any issue at all. No wear fatigue, at least to my ears, like this, right? And in fact, if you look at the size itself here, it is fairly on the larger side. Let's just proceed with the configuration itself. Let's have a look here. Okay, this is in fact a hybrid, a 5-driver hybrid. 4 of them balanced amateur. It's a Denmark Sonion balanced amateur, especially for the high frequency and the mid-range. And I think the accompanying dynamic driver, which is a 10mm liquid silicon dynamic driver, is designated more for lower frequency. And let's just have a look here, the most interesting one, right? You see that impedance rating? Rated at just 5.3 ohm. To be honest with you, that's probably the lowest I have seen yet. At least the sensitivity looks pretty much normal to me at 104 dB. As you can see on screen right now, against the light, it is quite visible that for these bronze colored stock tips, right, there is a foam inserted into the nozzle cavity itself. Okay, so it acts something like a sonic dampener, which means that the sound coming out from the drivers from the IEM is dampened a bit. However, if you want to have unfiltered sound directly from the driver, just have a look at the treble nozzle there. It is practically, see-through all the way. There's no dampening or filtration at all. And if you look at the bass nozzle, in fact, the red one has thicker density of foam. So which means that there's even more dampening of the sound frequency. And as a result of that, we have 3 different type of sound tuning. Okay, now let's talk a bit more on the tips, as you can see here. Okay, to be honest with you, I am not a user of silicone tips. And here, all of these are all silicone tips. I did spend a bit of time using some of them, especially these balance ear tips. But at the end of the day, I decided that, to use this my own tips here, which is Deconi foam tips. And in fact, 2 reasons for it. First, my ears. I am just not so comfortable wearing any type of silicone tips most of the time. And secondly, I think it just sounded much better with this silicone tip, because when I use silicone tips, usually I would be having some sort of lower frequency resonance or reverb, which I find very annoying. So what I'm trying to say is that in order to get the best sound out of this MS5, and in fact true for any type of highly configurable IEM, is to roll the tips. As I have shown you earlier, MS5 comes at a very low impedance rating of 5.3 ohm. So does it mean that this thing is easy to drive? Yes, definitely it is. I was able to plug this MS5 directly to my Sony Xperia 1 phone, which is kind of a bit weak at under 1 VRMS with just 60 milliwatt of power. And I was already hearing a very good output. Very satisfying, engaging, and vibrant output. Out of curiosity, I decided to test how much or how far can I push this Hidizs MS5. So, in order to do that, as you can see here, I have with me here this 4C Audio K5 Pro. And this thing is quite powerful. In fact, it is rated at 1000 milliwatt per channel at 16 ohm. And also I have here, fairly powerful as well, which is FIO Q11, offering 650 milliwatt of power at 32 ohm. And the most powerful one here, which is X-Duo MT602 Class A hybrid tube amp, offering 1300 milliwatt of power at 32 ohm. First thing that I'm hearing is that really impressed me was the background. It is so very silent. So instead of, let's say, exhibiting any kind of floor noise, even when attached to this tube amp, Class A some more, I am not hearing any kind of floor noise. Another part is that, scalability of this MS5. I was in fact impressed again that this MS5 was able to scale really well with power. I also have a few other DAC amp which I have here, which is my favorite one here, Hidizs FC6, as you can see here, right? This one. And iBasso DC04 Pro here, running on single-ended mode for this MS5. And I also have with me here this latest one, which is FIO KA5, which is I'm testing right now. What I'm trying to say is that I am getting really good response from this MS5. MS5 was transparent enough to exhibit different trait of sound signature, the timbre temperament itself, of how it scales with different level of tuning and different level of power. Before I proceed any further with sound analysis, impression, and rating itself, it is best for me to clarify about one very important thing. You see, as always with my audio review, it is influenced by my subjective preference towards sounds. Meaning that I don't do graph reading, I don't compare graph, I don't do measurement. So please keep that in mind. Alright? Okay, first, let's just have a look at the sound tuning for this MS5. In order to do that, let's just have a look at this graph here as provided by Hidizs. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't do graph or anything like that. But if there is a graph, I like to have a look at it so that I can get some indication what to expect. All right. And the first time when I look at it, I was like, wow, this is very colored. Yes. Manner of saying is that when you look at it, it is definitely very boosted all the way from lower frequency, especially lower frequency, mid-range, and even upper frequency. And in fact, my own ears confirm that this is definitely boosted in all frequencies. And now for the most important part, the sound itself. Let's talk about the sound element of this Hidizs MS5. Okay, in order to do that, let me just show you this. So, as you can see here, 10 different categories which I have identified, and each of them will be graded individually, and then the total score will then be used to determine the final rating of this MS5. Okay, now let's talk about dynamic presentation itself. First, this MS5 is definitely very well tuned with the way it handles dynamics. The dynamic transient itself is definitely very harmonious, despite the fact that this is a 5-driver hybrid. There's huge amount of, or should I say, very impressive element of coherency between the different driver handling different level of sound frequency. Remember that this thing have 5 driver. So we have 5 balanced armature handling the upper frequency and even the mid-range, and the dynamic driver handling more on the lower frequency. But what I am hearing is that a coherent sound. It is very fluid, harmonious, and the way it handles the dynamic transient itself, it is definitely analytical, resolving, and very clean sounding. Next, let's just have a look at the dynamic extension itself. this MS5 definitely extend really well on both ends, meaning that the upper frequency, the lower frequency, I was able to hear proper micro details, the decay itself from the upper frequency, which is the treble, and also the lower frequency, which is the sub bass. And that is a good indication that the extension itself is very well placed to the deepest possible region available in that sound frequency. Okay, now let's talk about tone and timbre presentation. And this is where I'm just going to bring in these three different tuning nozzle again, because the nature of this tuning nozzle are most evident and most impactful with this tone and timbre presentation of the sound temperament itself. For example, when I use this stock nozzle here, what I'm hearing is that a good balance of organic and analytical sound. It is in fact smooth sounding with very smooth upper frequency and also smooth lower frequency. And in fact, when I switch to the treble nozzle, the timbre itself, the sound signature itself become a bit more focused, a lot more on being analytical and less organic sounding. However, on the other side of it, the polarity of that sound will be totally changed, especially when I switch from treble nozzle to bass nozzle. Because the nature of this bass nozzle is that due to the thicker density of the filtration itself, it actually suppresses the upper frequency. So if you do that, in that process, what will happen is that the organic element to the sound itself will become even more evident, and you lose a bit of that analytical sound coming from the upper frequency. So in fact, what I'm trying to say is that this red nozzle, the bass nozzle, doesn't actually add any kind of bass or anything like that. It just simply suppresses the upper frequency. So the best way to look at this is that MS5, being very versatile, can actually give you three different flavor of tone and timbre presentation. Okay, now let's talk about the note weight and density. Regardless of which nozzle I use, be it bass, treble, or even the stock one, MS5 is definitely rich sounding. So what I'm trying to say is that the body of the sound itself offers good depth and definition, and it is in fact very vibrant and engaging. Perhaps one of the key element, or in fact the biggest appeal of this MS5 is in fact how it presents the lower frequency. I just like to make it clear first. Normally, I am not the type of person who enjoy bassy kind of IEM. And from that perspective, to me, this MS5 is in fact bass heavy, because normally I prefer a more neutral bass presentation. And if you look even at the graph earlier, it is definitely boosted. The strength of this MS5 is definitely at the mid bass section. So in fact, because of that, I can feel that the lower frequency, the presence of mid bass is very strong, very solid, impactful, and commanding. Despite that strong presence of mid bass, what I do like about this MS5 is that how the sub bass is being presented. That very strong mid bass does not overwhelm the sub bass. Another good thing which I would like to highlight on this MS5 bass performance is that how it handles different genre of bass. It does not matter whether it is like, string bass, electronic bass, or percussion bass for any type of music. The presence of the bass itself, it is definitely, like I mentioned earlier, is very solid, engaging, and vibrant. But perhaps the most important part is that the depth of the resolution of the bass itself, the layering itself, the texture. I just simply love it. Now let's have a look at the mid-range itself. Yet again, this tuning nozzle, as you can see here, will impart different sort of presentation for mid-range, depending on which one you choose to use. So let's just talk about the stock one first. And in general, I would say that the performance of mid-range for this MS5 is something which I consider as being fairly organic. And in fact, it exhibits a good amount of transparency to the sound itself, the way it presents the mid-range. For example, like the instrument. In fact, the attack and the decay itself, it is realistic sounding. despite a bit of hint of coloration or even warming effect. And that is also true for certain type of vocal. So for example, male type of vocal, which is the one that I am familiar with, which is baritone, deep and chesty vocal from people like, Morrissey or Nick Cave. So when I listen to those type of vocal using this MS5, what I'm hearing is that a presentation of vocal which is very intimate, commanding, and in fact, it impart a good sense of emotion to the presentation of the singing itself. And that is also pretty much applicable when we talk about female vocal, especially contralto type, people like Diana Krall or even Sini Egg, which is kind of a bit, again, chesty and deep. I can feel the emotion, especially when listening to, soft jazz or smooth jazz, modern jazz, and in fact, even for certain female vocal like Texas, which is a bit more on pop, it is definitely a bit more transparent rather than being warm sounding. All in all, I would say that the presentation of mid-range will be totally dependent on which nozzle you choose. So for example, the stock nozzle and even the red nozzle here, the best nozzle, in general, the presentation will be focused a bit more on being organic sounding, smooth and lush, and in fact, less analytical. However, when switching to the treble nozzle here, it will then be less organic, a bit more analytical, and in fact, a bit more pronounced on certain upper mid-range segment, especially with the Pina region. With very picky type of vocal, especially soprano, it can be a bit overbearing if you use the treble nozzle. And now let's talk about the treble performance itself. Yet again, it depends also which nozzle you use. So I'll just try to make this as simple as possible. All right. If you are treble sensitive, definitely you would not want to use the treble nozzle here, because this treble nozzle, I have found that it will be suitable only with certain type of music where the resolution and the imaging and the speed of the upper frequency is important. And for example, I use this treble nozzle only when I want to listen to classical music or instrumentals. For example, listening to Vivaldi or even Beethoven, where I need to hear a very crisp attack and decays with the violin upper frequency, or even the decay of the piano itself, or the cymbal or the splashes. Okay, and it is better presented with the treble nozzle. Whereas when I use the bass nozzle with that type of music, it is kind of a bit, recessed with the upper frequency itself. I'm losing a bit of sparkle. So depending on your need, if you want a bit more of energy, vibrancy, and in fact, air and sparkle, definitely you would want to use treble nozzle. But I would not recommend it to use with certain type of music, especially energetic music like rock or metal, or even very vibrant instrumental with lots of cymbals. And last but not least, definitely I would say that the treble itself is being highly resolving, even when with this red nozzle here. The decay itself, I can clearly hear the macro definition of the treble upper frequency and even the micro detail of it. Perhaps, I would say that especially when using the treble nozzle, the decay itself kind of a bit more crisp rather than smooth. And the smoothness will only be evident when using this stock nozzle or even the red nozzle. Now, let's talk about soundstage and spatial projection. First, I must say that, especially when using these stock tips here during the earlier stage, I was kind of a bit disappointed because I expected a bit more from this MS5. I must admit that the soundstage itself felt average. It is not exactly narrow, but I was hoping that for this kind of flagship material, it would be a bit wider. But hey, you know what? That is easily fixed by just simply switching to this different type of tips which suited my ears better. And true enough, when I switched to this deconiform tips, suddenly the sound itself felt a bit more open, wider, and the definition of the spacing itself is definitely improved. And in fact, another element which need to be considered is that when I connect this MS5 to my powerful DAC amp here, it seems that MS5 will scale really well when it comes to soundstage as the power goes up. So if you want more soundstage from this MS5, it's just a simple matter of bumping up the power you feed into this. This MS5 being a hybrid with 5 different drivers, definitely it excels really well with binaural or even holographic presentation. So I can safely say that regardless whether listening to music, binaural recording, or even for gaming, MS5 was able to impart a very good sense of immersion towards the surround sound, especially if the recording support 5.1 Dolby sort of presentation. And as for the rest of the technical aspect of this MS5, when it comes to resolution, imaging, details, and speed, definitely I would say that this MS5 is among the top performer which I have tested so far. For example, like the imaging itself, the crispness of the resolution, the details, macro and micro details, all are definitely excellent with this MS5. And definitely, in fact, due to the very resolving nature of this MS5, it is perhaps best not to use this MS5 with lower quality source or in fact, lo-fi. For example, if you listen to certain type of music on YouTube, and it does not give enough resolution, you would be hearing certain artifact in the sound itself. So in order to get the best sound for this MS5, just make sure that you are listening to a very good source. Last but not least, synergy and versatility. Anything that I have thrown at with this MS5, does not matter whether this full-size DAC amp, dongles, or even straight from my phone, MS5 was able to synergize really well. And in fact, talking about versatility, you see here, what I have in my hand right now is an impedance adapter, alright? And the purpose of using this impedance adapter, and in fact this one is 50 ohm, when I attach it like this and pair it with more powerful sounding partner, it gets even better. Now, practically, this MS5 is running at around almost 60 over ohm of impedance. And when I attach it to powerful source, I just really love the output. It is just gets better and better in every way possible. Okay, now that we have covered pretty much everything about the sound aspect of this MS5, let's just find out the total score. As you can see there, right, from 1 until 10, I have graded MS5 individually, which each of these element, and MS5 in fact score a total score of 88 out of 100. And definitely at 88, if you look at my grading system, this is a 5-star rated IM. Okay, now before I finalize my review on this MS5, let's just do a quick comparison with IM which I have tested before within similar price range. So manner of saying is that something which is above 200 but below 500. First that came into my mind was this Full Performer 5, which I have reviewed and tested recently. And I would say that when I listen to this MS5 for the first time, in fact, I am hearing pretty much a similar sort of sound presentation. It is definitely like, colored, boosted, and very engaging, very dynamic, and in fact, fun sounding. However, the main difference would be that I must say that a full P5 is still the one with heavier, lower frequency performance, which means that this P5 is a bit more bassy than this MS5. So, if you like a bit more of balance, a bit more of analytical approach, and a bit more resolving with the definition, and a bit of brightness, especially when using this treble nozzle, definitely MS5 can offer that. The next comparison which I would like to bring up is against this C Audio Bravery AE. And in fact, this Bravery AE is another 4 balance amateur IM. In fact, Sonion as well, similar to this MS5. The main difference being is that this Bravery AE does not have any kind of dynamic driver inside it. And another element which separate them is that the tuning itself. You see, This Bravery AE is tuned to be a bit closer to being neutral, less energetic and less vibrant, and also less colored. So, matter of saying is that to make things a bit simpler, you see here, this Sennheiser HD650. Between this AE and this HD650, I categorize them as within similar sort of sound presentation. Whereas, when it comes to this MS5, I would place it, in fact, together with this Hi-Fi Man HE400 SE with the way they present sound. It is, in fact, pretty much similar when it comes to the energy level, except that Hi-Fi Man is, of course, a bit more neutral. So that's pretty much the comparison with Bravery AE. And the final comparison which I'd like to bring up against this MS5 is, in fact, another Hidizs IM which I have tested some time ago. I have reviewed this Hidizs MD4. The main difference between these two is that, first, the tuning itself. I would say that definitely MD4 is a bit more neutral sounding. It is less energetic and less vibrant. And in fact, the overall presentation between these two is that if you prefer a bit more reserved presentation, definitely MD4 will provide you that. But if you want a bit more of adventurous, fun sounding, energetic and vibrant presentation, then MS5 is the answer. Okay, now let's just wrap things up for this Hidizs MS5. With everything considered, I would just simply say that this IM definitely present a very wholesome and complete solution for an IM, considering that for the price asked, this MS5 offers 3 different type of sound tuning, which is highly usable for different type of genre of music, and in fact, for different type of requirement. Definitely, I would say that this is one IM which is easy for me to recommend if you want something which is very versatile, high quality with the sound itself, and in fact, the tuning itself, I would consider as being hi-fi yet fun. Thank you for staying with me until the end of the video. I hope that has been informational and useful to you. I enjoy it, and you have a good day there.